Hello, everyone. Mr. Daldis here with your Chapter 17 reading for Chapter 17, Section 2, Enlightenment Ideas Spread. Paris, France, the heart of the Enlightenment, drew many intellectuals and others eager to debate new ideas. Reforms proposed one evening became the talk of the town the next day. Enlightenment ideas flowed from France, across Europe, and beyond. Everywhere, thinkers examined traditional beliefs and customs in the light of reason and found them flawed. Even some absolute monarchs experimented with Enlightenment ideas, although they drew back when changes threatened the established way of doing things. New ideas challenged society. Enlightenment ideas spread quickly through many levels of society. Educated people all over Europe eagerly read not only Diderot's encyclopedia, but also the small, inexpensive pamphlets that printers churned out on the broad range of issues. More and more, people saw the reform was necessary in order to achieve a just society. During the Middle Ages, most Europeans had accepted without question a society based on divine right rule, a strict class system, and a belief in heavenly reward for earthly suffering. In the age of reason, such ideas seemed unscientific and irrational. A just society, Enlightenment thinkers thought, should ensure social justice and happiness in this world. Not everyone agreed with this idea of replacing the values that existed, however. Writers faced censorship. Most, but not all, government and church authorities felt they had a sacred duty to defend the old order. They believed that God had set up the old order. To protect against the attacks of the Enlightenment, they waged a war of censorship, or restricting access to ideas and information. They banned and burned books and imprisoned writers. To avoid censorship, the philosophers and writers like Montesquieu and Voltaire sometimes disguised their ideas in works of fiction. In the Persian Letters, Montesquieu used two fictional Persian travelers named Uzbek and Rika to mock French society. The hero of Voltaire's satirical novel Candide, published in 1759, travels across Europe and even to the Americas and the Middle East in search of the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire slyly uses the tale to expose the corruption and hypocrisy of European society. Ideas spread in salons. New literature, the arts, science, and philosophy were regular topics of discussion in salons, or informal social gatherings at which writers, artists, and philosophers and others exchanged ideas. The salon originated in the 1600s when a group of noble women in Paris began inviting a few friends to their homes for poetry readings. By the 1700s, some middle class women began holding salons. Here, middle-class citizens would meet with the nobility on equal footing to discuss and spread Enlightenment ideas. Madame Zoffran ran one of the most respected salons. In her home on Rue Street, Rue Saint-Honoré, she brought together the brightest and most talented people of her day. The young musical genius Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart played for her guests, and Diderot was a regular at her weekly dinners for the philosophers and poets. Checkpoint. What did those opposed to the Enlightenment ideas do to stop the spread of information? Arts and literature reflect new ideas. In the 1600s and 1700s, the arts evolved to meet changing tastes. As in earlier periods, artists and composers had to please their patrons, the men and women who commissioned work from them or gave them jobs. From grandeur to charm. In the age of Louis XIV, courtly art and architecture were either in the Greek and Roman tradition or in a grand ornate style known as Baroque. Baroque paintings were huge, colorful, and full of excitement. They glorified historic battles or the lives of saints. Such works matched the grandeur of European courts at the time. Louis XV and his court led a much less formal lifestyle than Louis XIV. Architects and designers reflected this change by developing the Rococo style. Rococo art moved away from religion, and unlike the heavier splendor of the Baroque, was lighter, elegant, and charming. Rococo art in salons was believed to encourage the imagination. Furniture and tapestries featured delicate shells and flowers, and more pastel colors were used. Portrait painters showed noble subjects in charming rural settings, surrounded by happy servants and pets. Although the style was criticized by the philosophes for its superficiality, it had a vast audience in the upper class and with a growing middle class as well. The Enlightenment inspires composers. The new Enlightenment ideals led composers and musicians to develop new forms of music. There was a tradition in music as well as in art from the Baroque style to Rococo. An elegant style of music known as classical followed. Ballets and opera, plays set to music, were performed at royal courts, and opera houses sprang up from Italy to England. Before this era, only the social elite could afford to commission musicians to play for them. In the early to mid 1700s, however, the growing middle class could afford to pay for concerts to be performed publicly. Among the towering musical figures of the era was Johann Sebastian Bach. A devout German Lutheran, Bach wrote beautiful religious works for organ and choirs. He also wrote sonatas for violin and harpsichord. Another German-born composer, George Friedrich Handel, spent much of his life in England. There he wrote water music and other pieces for King George I, as well as more than 30 operas. His most celebrated work, The Messiah, combines instruments and voices and is often performed at Christmas and Easter. Composer Franz Joseph Haydn was one of the most important figures in the development of classical music. He helped develop forms of the string quartet and the symphony. Haydn had a close friendship with another famous composer, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was a child prodigy who gained instant celebrity status as a composer and performer. His brilliant operas, graceful symphonies, and moving religious music helped define a new style of composition. Although he died in poverty at age 35, he produced an enormous amount of music during his lifetime. Mozart's musical legacy thrives today. The novel takes shape. By the 1700s, literature developed new forms and a wider audience. Middle-class readers, for example, liked stories about their own times told in straightforward prose. One result was an outpouring of novels, or long works of prose fiction. English novelists wrote many popular stories. Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe, an exciting tale about a sailor shipwrecked on a tropical island. This novel is still well known today. In a novel called Pamela, Samuel Richardson used a series of letters to tell a story about a servant girl. This technique was adopted by other authors of the period. Checkpoint. How did the arts and literature change as Enlightenment ideas spread? Enlightened despots embraced new ideas. The court of Europe became enlivened as philosophers tried to persuade rulers to adopt their ideas. The philosophers hoped to convince the ruling classes that reform was necessary. Some monarchs did accept Enlightenment ideas. Others still practiced absolutism, a political doctrine in which a monarch has seemingly unlimited power. Those that did accept these new ideas became enlightened despots, or absolute rulers who used their power to bring about political and social change. Friedrich II attempts reform. Friedrich II, known as Friedrich the Great, exerted extremely tight control over his subjects during his reign as King of Prussia from 1740 to 1786. Still, he saw himself as the first servant of the state and a duty to work for the common good. Friedrich openly praised Voltaire's work and invited several of the French intellectuals of the age to Prussia. Some of his first acts as king were to reduce the use of torture and allow a free press. Most of Friedrich's reforms were directed at making the Prussian government more efficient. To do this, he reorganized the government's civil service and simplified laws. Friedrich also tolerated religious differences, welcoming victims of religious persecution. "In my kingdom," he said, "everyone can go to heaven in his own fashion." His religious tolerance and also his disdain for torture showed Friedrich's genuine belief in enlightened reform. In the end, however, Friedrich's desire for a stronger monarchy and more power for himself. Catherine the Great studies philosophers' works. Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, read the works of the philosophers and exchanged letters with Voltaire and Diderot. She praised Voltaire as someone who had fought the united enemies of humankind: superstition, fanaticism, ignorance, and trickery. Catherine believed that the Enlightenment ideas of equality and liberty. Catherine, who became empress in 1762, toyed with implementing Enlightenment ideas. Early in her reign, she made some limited reforms in law and government. Catherine abolished torture, and established religious tolerance in her land. She granted nobles a charter of rights and criticized the institution of serfdom. Still, like Frederick in Prussia, Catherine did not intend to give up power. In the end, her main political contribution to Russia proved to be an expanded empire. Joseph II continues reform. In Austria, Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa ruled as an absolute monarch. Although she did not push for reforms, she is considered to be an enlightened despot by some historians because she worked to improve peasants' way of life. The most radical of the enlightened despots was her son and successor, Joseph II. Joseph was an eager student of the Enlightenment. He traveled in disguise amongst his subjects to learn of their problems. Joseph continued the work of Maria Theresa, who had begun to modernize Austria's government. Despite opposition, Joseph supported religious equality for Protestants and Jews in his Catholic empire. He ended censorship by allowing a free press and attempted to bring the Catholic Church under royal control. He sold the property of many monasteries that were not involved in education or the care of the sick and used the proceeds to support those that were. Joseph even abolished serfdom. Like many of his other reforms, however, this measure was canceled after his death. Checkpoint. Why were the philosophes interested in sharing their beliefs with European rulers? Lives of the majority changed slowly. Most Europeans were untouched by either courtly or middle-class culture. They remained what they had always been, peasants living in small rural villages. Echoes of serfdom still remain throughout Europe despite advances in Western Europe. Their culture, based on centuries-old traditions and that changed slowly. By the late 1700s, however, radical ideas about equality and social justice finally seeped into peasant villages. While some peasants eagerly sought to topple the old order, others resisted efforts to bring about change. In the 1800s, war and political upheaval, as well as changing economic conditions, would transform peasant life in Europe. Checkpoint. During this time, why did change occur slowly for most Europeans? That's the end of section 2. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.